We're entering this exponential trajectory, and our antiquated minds cannot possibly keep up unless we change the stories, change the programming, and change the hardware.
Introducing elements into complex systems is a tricky bit of business, and he advocates that we do so slowly, carefully, and reversibly.
Technology doesn't slow down for anybody.
Our operating systems are basically emotional. The one emotion that rules them all is fear.
We evolved to be coordinating social creatures, primarily because it's an evolutionary advantage for survival.
Upgrading human OS, that ain't easy.
One of the most critical pieces is removing as much of the negative storytelling as you can, because it's everywhere. There's too much information in order for one creature to carry it on, absorb it all, pass it all on.
Change the system, change the incentives, and voila, guess what happens? People change their behavior.
If we can't get the right stories out there, then we can't change the trajectory, and we'll end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. You know, I often talk about Prometheans being among us with all of the changes that are occurring. And I think I have one such Promethean as my guest today. Sam McRoberts is the author of The Grand Redesign, in which he makes a very compelling case for our need as a species. We humans need to rapidly develop our outdated hardware and software to keep pace with and discover new things through harnessing tech change and changing our own software. And the way to do that is through stories. We seem to run on that as our fuel. Sam, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate you having me. And you nailed it. Like, that's it. Change the stories, change the world.
Well, you had me at that line alone. I think you and I are really simpatico on a ton of stuff. And as I was reading your book, I'm just like saying to anyone within earshot, this is an upgrade manual for human OS. This is like it right here. So let's dive right in. First off, why'd you write this? What did you write it to provide a user manual for upgrading human OS?
So as I say at the end of the book, like I put this to paper or digital paper, but the whole thing kind of popped into my head fully formed. I didn't have to sit down and work through an outline. I didn't have to do a bunch of research. Like, the whole idea, it just kind of slid in there. I was like, oh, well, that's pretty good. And then I sat down and over the course of maybe 15 or 20 hours, banged it out. And so I guess I kind of wrote it, but the underlying purpose and the overwhelming feeling that I had is just that things need to change. We're entering this exponential trajectory, and our antiquated minds cannot possibly keep up unless we change the stories, change the programming, and change the hardware. We're not going to make it. And so this seemed to be a great way to do three things. The first being to very simply and clearly make people aware of a lot of the stuff that operates behind the scenes that most never even realize is going on. The second, to take a really cold, hard look at the scope of our current technology and where we're aiming and where we could end up. And lastly, specifically, a handful of points and stories and mechanisms to try and harness some of these problems to be benefits until we can fix and upgrade the issues.
Yeah. And we are incredibly aligned in our beliefs that this is really not optional. This is required.
Yes.
And I love the vehicle that you use, the Watcher. And as you were talking about how it just hit you, I thought, of course, of Nikola Tesla, who said he didn't invent anything. It all came to him from the Watcher, maybe, right? And by the way, if you're familiar with the biographies of many scientists, inventors, etc., what is a very common theme is exactly that, I saw the DNA helix in a dream. And,
yes,
I think that there is so much more. And like we could talk an hour about whether consciousness is actually external and all we really are receivers and broadcasters. But I don't want to do that because this book is so great and you actually create a guide, a user's guide for what we need to do. So I want to jump right into that. But I first want to ask about the Watcher. I want you to explain to our audience the concept of the Watcher. And I have a question that I'd like you to address as you do that. Is the Watcher an unreliable narrator?
Interesting. So the Watcher in a nutshell would be perhaps one of the oldest members of a civilization from the far, far distant past. Consider it one of the earliest civilizations to rise and attain a post-scarcity, their base programming society. And having reached that post-scarcity space is left to find and pursue whatever their authentic interests are. In the case of this Watcher and a number of other similar folks, they go around the universe looking for intelligent life and observing. They want to see what's going on. They want to see their stories. They want to try their foods. They want to experience their evolution and chronicle all of it, because to them it seems like such a waste that any of this creativity should be lost. But for a number of reasons, they can't interfere. They're not comfortable interfering. They've had problems interfering in the past. And so they have rules and constraints. They watch only, they don't interfere. And this particular Watcher is getting really tired of non-interference. He's found a culture that he's particularly attached to and doesn't want them to fizzle out, and sees that this culture is at a key inflection point and decides, fuck it, I'm going to interfere.
I love it.
And whether or not it's an unreliable narrator, I don't know. Reliable from what point of view? I mean, it thinks it's reliable, he, she, whatever it is, but it has an agenda. So maybe not perfectly.
So yeah, that's why I ask, right? Because, Joe Norman, who's a complexity scientist, argues that introducing elements into complex systems is a tricky bit of business. And he advocates that we do so slowly, carefully, and reversibly. I think it's the last one that he really underlines. What are your thoughts on that?
I think maybe that would be in an ideal scenario. That's just not the way things typically pan out. I mean, technology doesn't slow down for anybody. Every now and then you might be able to get a little bit of a break or a buffer in there, but usually not. Usually it's rolling forward as fast as people can come up with ideas and try them. And it's one of those things that fortunately or unfortunately, maybe a bit of both, compounds. So the faster it goes and the more ideas and the more people there are having ideas and trying things, the more this corpus of experience and thought builds up and gains momentum, like a snowball rolling down a hill and picking up more matter as it goes. It just gets bigger and faster. And so I think it might be nice sometimes if we could slow things down. I mean, the pain comes in large part from the speed, but I don't think that's realistic.
Yeah. And you make the point in the book that, essentially for me, echoing Jed McKenna, that we humans, our operating systems are basically emotional. And Jed would say that the one emotion that rules them all is fear. And that you can, if you decide to look at the history of humanity through a lens, you could add a lot of clarity if you looked at it through societies making fear-based decisions. It leads to the precautionary principle. It leads us to believe that what we know now is true and real, where I think we both know that's a load of bullshit. Because if we went back to just even 500 years ago and we were able to isolate the most intelligent human on the planet, or a group, if you want to make it a bigger thing, the top decile of the smartest people on the planet, almost everything that they believed to be true was not true, right?
Yeah, I mean, all maps are flawed. No map is the territory, and there'll be dragons at your edges, no matter how far out you push those edges.
Truly, the map is not the territory. Fabulous illustration that really makes the case. Let's talk about, first off, I love social iOS. Okay. And then, so explain it for our listeners and viewers, and then kind of go down the list because I think they're all really important. The whole idea of in-group versus out-group, what stokes that? How can we ameliorate that situation? Status games. I had Will Storr on Infinite Loops, and like, what a wonderful guy.
Brilliant.
And yeah, total brilliant. But his assessment at the end of the day is there's no escaping them, man. There is no workaround because they are just so in our base code that you got to learn to live with them. But then also mimetic behavior, mimetic contagion, and then bring in emotion. So I've just given you maybe a 20-minute spot.
You're going to have to re-cue me up on each one. I couldn't remember the exact order to save my soul. But social OS, we'll start there with the overarching view. I mean, we evolved to be coordinating social creatures, primarily because it's an evolutionary advantage for survival. It's also one of those things where there's too much information in order for one creature to carry it on, absorb it all, pass it all on. Like, you can't do it one-to-one. You need many-to-many. So we evolved to work together to gain better resources, defend ourselves, mate, control our environments. And so we have these deeply rooted social components. I mean, one of those would be the in-group versus out-group bias. When you're living in an incredibly scarce environment, resources are limited, your survival is tenuous, you want to hang on to whatever you find and keep it for you. Like, you don't know when you're going to find more food or a safer place to live or better hunting grounds. You don't want to share those things. And anybody who comes along is a threat to the resources for your group. And so we developed this wiring for us, our group, and then anybody else who might want stuff that our group has and needs to survive. And again, we mentioned like the antiquated wiring. Like, this is wiring that's been in place for 50,000 plus years at least, probably far longer, and hasn't really changed in at least the last 50,000 years. And so we're operating on the programming that fit really well in caves and savannas and doesn't work quite as well in such massive groups as we find ourselves now.
Totally agree. And you hit the idea about scarcity driving it, and we're moving into hopefully a more abundant age. Certainly when you can make digital goods that have zero cost of reproducing, that alone, you need to think through the implications of that if you want to understand how society is going to evolve. And
the implications are huge. I mean, Star Trek is really kind of the archetype for that post-scarcity world. And it showcases a lot of the pros and some of the cons. But it it glazes a lot over the transition period from scarcity to non-scarcity. It's just like, there's a big war, the eugenics war, there's a lot of fallout. We went through a bunch of changes. Now look at us, we're awesome. Bit of the hand-wavy-ism or whatever they call it in sci-fi. But it really, it's that transition period that's rough because you have to move from the economic engine of consumption, which is what we have now, to one where there's no incentive whatsoever for consumption. And consumption, there's no marginal cost to create. Energy is free or effectively limitless. The entire system breaks. And it's not easy. You can't just flip a switch and make it happen. There's too many moving pieces and way too much momentum. And so that, I think, is probably one of the biggest challenges out of all of this, is that transition period, which is where we find ourselves.
And I agree. And that's why I'm so taken with the book, because it's a guide, as I said at the opening, to upgrading human OS. And that ain't easy, as one who has tried many times to at least upgrade my own human OS. You find yourself, it's hard first. Second, you've got to document it because your brain is designed to make you forget things it doesn't want to remember. You have in the book that, basically everything happens in the subconscious and then it gives directions to the conscious, which I tend to believe.
Yeah, your favorite, the Robert Anton Wilson's Thinker and Prover.
Yeah.
Thinker thinks, prover proves.
Yep, exactly. And it takes those instructions quite literally. And so if you can understand that and grok it and use it, it's like magic, really, because all of a sudden, a world that looked like it was filled with trouble and strife looks like, hey, the future's so bright, I got to wear shades. But it also is hard. And
Super.
So one of my questions is how, and you do it in the book, that's why I'm setting you up for the answer here. How are we going to get a significant enough minority of people kind of trailblazing here?
I think there's a lot of components to that. I mean, the first and most important component is just the stories. We have a tremendous number of stories flying around, books, movies, music, media, social media. There's tons of stories, competing stories, conflicting stories of all types. And there's a sequence of things that we would need to do to kind of reverse this negative trajectory. And, as we talked about the social OS, there's a lot of components that are deeply rooted and hardwired, but can be overcome through story. So I think one of the most critical pieces is removing as much the negative storytelling as you can, because it's everywhere. I mean, that's how these ad-driven media companies make their money. Like, they want to piss you off. They want to irritate you. They want you to feel strong emotions because those get eyeballs on ads. And it's an awful set of incentives. So it's up to you to recognize what's happening, recognize how you're being manipulated, and start culling your diet, so to speak, your information diet. So for me, I try and tear out absolutely everything that's based around negativity. If it's not optimistic and hopeful, I generally avoid it because I want to look at the future with hope and optimism. And I think there's a lot of people that I observe who have realized that and have made changes. People who've gotten off social media entirely or who've carefully curated their information diet. I feel like that's swelling because there's been such a massive depression and anxiety stemming from this influx of negative stories that people are starting to see it and wake up.
I agree. And I think that I have always equated the negative story tsunami with it's also happens to be appealing to that Jed McKinnon base emotion of fear of the new, especially novel fears, novel dangers are things that we, if we go to Claude Shannon, he would say that's information. And so the information immediately gets our attention. You know how our brains work, right? And if I'm looking around my environment here and everything's the same, my brain essentially stops being interested, right? It's just like, okay,
yes,
it's identical. So I wonder how, it's obviously and it's one that aligns perfectly with my mission at O'Shaughnessy Ventures, right? We had a competition for infinite loops and to write optimistic stories about the future. And
White Mirror. I love it.
Yeah. And I found this guy, Tinker Thinking, and he's amazing. Right. And I want to make a ton of his stories into movies when I get the AI capability in infinite films. I'd like to make this into an AI movie. Is there enough? The thing from Arrested Development, there are dozens of us, dozens. And I wonder, is dozens enough, right?
I don't know. I mean, if you poke around in the spiritual space, you'll constantly come across this idea of someday, eventually, somehow we will reach this tsunami of awareness. There'll be this mass awakening. I don't know if that's the case. I mean, if you look at the history of humanity, it's much more been a very small subset of people dragging everybody else along, kicking and screaming and burning them at the stake. There's no mass awakening. So I don't know. I don't know if we're going to actually pull it off. But I see tons of these outliers, these heretics out there poking at the edges, figuring things out, creating new technology, pushing things forward, and still dragging people kicking and screaming. I mean, the latest being artists and writers pissed off at AI. There will always be people upset as things roll forward, but there's so many positive things on the other side. It's just reframing it. It's helping them to see that. So I think one of the best things that those who are on the leading edge, one of the best things they can do is try and work to reframe that. Like, hey, this isn't trying to steal work from you. This is trying to augment your abilities. This isn't trying to make you obsolete. This is trying to make you exceptional. And those are the stories though. Like you need better stories, better framing. And one of my favorite things and yet biggest beefs is dystopian sci-fi. I love it, and I hate it. Because what was the Ezra Klein article that just came out? It was like, I forget the title. I just shared it earlier today too. It was something along the lines of the dystopia we're expecting is preventing us from having the utopia we deserve, or something to that effect.
I think that's the title. Yeah, I read it. It was a good piece.
And it falls back to like Kyla's vibe session thing. There are a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think if we can't get the right stories out there, then we can't change the trajectory, and we'll end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy. We'll end up with dystopia just because everybody was expecting it and nobody took steps to create anything better, or resisted the steps to make things better because they thought it was impossible, pie in the sky.
Yeah. And I feel quite passionately about that and agree wholeheartedly. But I also think I know I'm probably wrong, or I'm at least missing something. What I'm up against here, right? Because it seems the default is that, right? I'm the same as you. I love science fiction, right? And I've read a ton of it. I have done a bunch of science fiction treatments. For example, when I was reading your stuff and The Watcher, I had this treatment where the most advanced civilization in the world, right, gets pinged by various civilizations when they're ready to get this incredible, and in the version of the thing, it's a spacecraft, but they finally ping somebody on Earth. Earth reaches a position where someone like sends the signal out to this civilization, and they show up, and they don't have bodies, right? They're pure energy, but they have to take on the thing. And basically the story is that, yeah, we are in a multiverse. Yeah, they're all pushed together. This craft lets you go anywhere in the multiverse, but also anywhere in the time in the multiverse. And the original picture of Earth is just Earth, right? And so the human goes and looks at some others, and it's like, it's so many versions of that world because people have been going around and changing it. And like I never did much with it because as I reread it, I'm like, this kind of is dystopia in a way. And I don't want that to happen. Right. And like, so people get all like obsessed with their own lives. And so they look at Gym 1 through Gym 10,000 and they're like, but they learn. Right. So they learn because they're looking at versions of themselves that multiplied by 0. And so, but like, it's hard to come up with a good hook for science fiction in particular that doesn't like have Terminators and doesn't have aliens that want to eat and kill us. It's why horror is so appealing, right?
Well, if you look back at our evolution has always been zero-sum conflict based. And so our stories that we told around the campfires that we used to teach and indoctrinate were zero-sum conflict based stories. And so the stories that appeal most to us naturally are those that have some form of conflict, that are zero-sum, which is what a dystopian sci-fi is. Utopian sci-fi is boring. Everybody lived happily ever after, the end. There is no story arc. It doesn't follow any of the prescribed patterns. And that's why it's hard to make it stick, I think. And somehow we are going to have to get beyond that. I think there are ways, and again, like Star Trek. I think Star Trek did an enormous amount of good for a lot of nerds who went on to reshape a lot of aspects of the world because it gave them ideas and made them hopeful. They want to see something like that. Like, wouldn't it be great to have a non-zero-sum game to play for once? And have tried in various ways to make that happen. And I think we're progressing there. Like, we're getting some of the pieces. It's just never as fast as we'd like it to be.
That's one of the mandates of O'Shaughnessy Ventures, right? We won't look at anything that is not what we perceive as a positive sum win-win game. We don't care how great it is. I did a Spaces last night and I talked about, like, if somebody came to me with a payday lending scheme that was 10x better than the current ones, I would say no, because I think they're predatory. I think that they're basically you could make the other argument. I have friends who disagree vehemently with me and say these people don't have banks. They need the ability to. And I'm like, yeah, right. But charging them usurious interest rates on their paycheck, I think, is not an optimal way to do that. And so what's interesting is it really focuses, we've been doing it for months now, and it really focuses the mind. There are a lot of pitches that just go out because they're based on zero-sum conflicts. And we're going to kill them. We're going to destroy the competition. No.
And you have such a huge advantage being your own LP that you can set this like, sure, I mean, a return is great, but at the same time, the return you're looking for is a better future, which is the best return for everybody, which is amazing.
Exactly. And, selfishly, it's the best return for me and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. And why wouldn't I want that to happen?
So, and like at the end of the book, as part of the sequence of things that I included in there to kind of reshape things, like that's one of it. The idea of the pay it forward, like pledge plus lotto. There's this idea in there of an open pledge that anybody can sign it, committing to do something good for a stranger every day, something kind.
Yeah, I love that.
No strings attached. You commit to doing this, you commit publicly. And then the counter to it would be kind of like Warren Buffett fund. I'll give away at least half my wealth before I die, or all of it after I die, or something to that effect. I forget I'm blanking on the name of it, but something like that to back it, so that every day there's a payout equivalent to the GDP, 1 year's GDP in each country to people participating at random. So every day you pick one person from each country and you pay them out this amount. And all you have to do to be eligible for that is to commit to sign this pledge publicly. Like, you don't have to prove that you're being good, but we like to live up to our ideals. If we commit to something, our brain is going to try and make us hold tight to it. But you hit all of the angles. With that set of things, you get the people who genuinely want to be altruistic. You get the people who want to be seen to be altruistic. You get the people who want a reward out of it.
Right.
Like, you hit all your bases. And the reason behind being good is completely irrelevant. More good makes the world better. So I don't care. I don't care what your motivations are. I just care that you try each day to do something good for somebody. The world will be a better place.
I love that idea, because I hate the nags and the scolds and you have to do this for the planet, or you have to do this for whatever. And fuck you, man. I mean, I love the aspect of you just got to sign the pledge. And because the prover takes over, right? And like, one of the things that I found through research is sometimes changing your physical environment actually changes you. And it's really interesting. That's why I'm a big fan of travel and, taking different landing spots, right? It sometimes changes your behavior. But what I love about your thing is, it's like Bucky Fuller said, changing human nature is like really almost impossible, but changing the underlying system, that's pretty easy. So change the system, change the incentives, and voila, guess what happens? People change their behavior.
Incentives are one of my absolute most favorite topics. I think I first started really honing in on them when I heard about the Cobra effect. The story of the Indian government wanted to get rid of a proliferation of cobras. They were a danger to people. So they started paying, a reward every time somebody brought in a dead cobra. And so people turned around and started breeding cobras and figured out what was going on. So they stopped the system, and then they turned all the cobras loose, and there were more cobras in the wild than there were when they first started the system. And that really latched into my mind. I was like, holy shit, I'd never really thought about incentives that way. And so I started really digging into that. But yes, you change the incentives, sometimes even in very simple ways. And as long as you understand what makes people tick, it's very easy to determine how those incentives are going to play out.
The whole idea of mimetic behavior, we can latch on to that, because it's, at least in my mind, I am not somebody who yes, this is the answer to everything, right? No, it's not. But it is a piece, and it is something interesting that you can figure out how to reconfigure if you're trying to do what you're advocating here, the great
Yes.
reset.
But this actually circles back perfectly to the social OS piece and status games.
Yeah.
So I actually think the optimal way to get anything to spread is to get the highest status people to spread it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly the type of story that the wealthy and powerful and influential, if we could get them to read and understand and commit to making this a thing, so many other people would fall in line just because of status games. They want to be seen to be doing the things that those in high status are doing. They want to be a part of their tribe. And so, fine, that would work.
Yeah. And I think, that's kind of an edge case with Buffett's whole pledge thing. The problem that I have with that is it's pretty clear that it's being taken over by Bogans. And, the administration of it is troubling to me.
I guess. Where there's money, there's parasites.
Always. And you're never going to escape that, I don't think. Even if we did everything in your book, we're going to still have a parasite problem. And that brings us to kind of like people like, well, you're a wild-eyed optimist and, there are going to be problems. Of course there are going to be problems. Let's hope much better problems, and then we'll solve those too.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I am optimistic, but I am also a very realistic skeptic. And I know how people are, and I know how slow some things can be to change. But I am thinking of this in terms of dominoes. I'm trying to figure out what are the dominoes that actually lead to the optimal pattern in the end. And, we can change our stories and kind of counteract or work with instead of against some of our ingrained pieces, which is really just to buy us time to actually be able to take over our hardware. And we're getting a lot closer to that on numerous fronts. I mean, I realistically think within the next decade or two, we'll be able to change a great deal about our human biology, change our minds, change the way we think, have more control over emotions, have more control over the algorithms and wiring that we're running. Like, I really think a lot of that is not terribly far out. We just need to buy some time to not fuck ourselves over until we get there.
Yeah, I agree. And, which brings me to one of my favorite topics, which is how do we break the Shannon limit? I could fill a library with cognitive bias literature, right? And yet we've known about, like when I did my first company in 1987, right? It wasn't called behavioral finance. I found a book about psychology, and it basically listed all of what were then just called plain old cognitive biases. And that was the paper I wrote for the company and everything else. Okay, flash forward 30 years and we've got Danny Kahneman as a celebrity and Annie Duke is like making her bones writing about all this stuff. And numerous friends of mine are starting companies this is how we're going to do it, right? And I think Thaler and somebody else launched a behavioral finance fund. And yet, fuck it, if any of it changes, right? How do we reprogram? If you take Timothy Leary seriously, you would say you reprogram by becoming a meta-programmer and using psychedelics and allowing the person to re-imprint themselves of the printing, to get rid of the imprinting that they had no control over that happened when they were a kid, right? But are there other ideas that you have for like breaking through the Shannon limit, reprogramming these cognitive biases that are like mental mirages, right? There's no water there, but you still run to get a drink.
Yes. I think part of it is that a lot of those things are set to run automatically in environments of scarcity. And so this couples back to the whole progressing towards hopefully a post-scarcity future. Anything that we can do to raise somebody's baseline on Maslow's hierarchy of needs gives their brain the bandwidth to actually act on some of the things they may already know. I think the average person probably knows a lot of their issues and recognizes maybe subconsciously or without the actual language to describe it, what some of these biases are, but they just don't have any fucking bandwidth to deal with it. They have too many other things on their plate. They're scrambling to pay rent and put food on the table and deal with the stress of work and the crazy political environment and all these other things. Like, they're not in a good position to act on knowledge. So, which is why, Simon, we need to do both. We need to equip people with the knowledge so that they can see what's running but then also help them to get to a place where they can act on that knowledge because they're no longer struggling to keep their head above water.
Yeah. And one of the ways I frame it is they are distracted to end. If I was an evil genius trying to get people to comply with my will, I would fucking have bread and circuses and distractions and phony debates, and I would be 24-hour news. I don't care what team you're rooting for. They're all the same as far as I'm concerned. They feel compelled and entitled that they should be able to control your life. And like the prototype is like, read history, man. It's like they're all the same.
If somebody wants to be in power, they probably shouldn't be there. It's very simple.
Exactly. I had an idea again for these fictional treatments that I might actually be able to get a chance to turn them all into movies. How cool would that be? But it was basically, the treatment was Washington became so out of touch, right? And so ignorant of the state of like tech, of like what we see today, right? We have people thinking that they should be able to regulate artificial intelligence who have zero understanding of artificial intelligence and a bunch of other things too, right? And so in the story, what happened was Americans, being a kind of a roll up your sleeve people, decided, let's fuck this. They built a wall around Washington, D.C. and convinced all the pals within that they were doing it to protect them from all the horrible terrorists who wanted to kill them. And so what the real dodge was that they ignored them completely. And they made sure that within the walls, everybody had, this was written a long time ago, so it was pre-social media, but everyone had their own reporter who would issue a blippo-second update on what that politician was saying we should do. And the whole thing opens in a field in Iowa where a group of people who have been chosen at random from the national lottery, a little bit like your thing, right, have to go. And everyone is like really bummed out because this particular gathering is they're going to pick they're randomly select the person who's going to get the nuclear football, right? Because we've got to keep the appearances up, right? And somebody's got to have that. And so, but everything is done by a random selection process. And then everything is adjudicated through jury systems where people who are also randomly selected.
I like this. And I thought about this exact sort of thing. I think I'd do a twist. So the idea of, instead of people who run for positions of power, I do think it should be as a service instead. I don't think it should be random. I think it should be basically put up to a suggestion system, and it should be domain specific. So we feel like we need a law for this thing. Who are the experts on this topic? And those people are floated up based on asking people around that space until you get a pool of candidates. You draw from that as a jury, and as a term of service, you come together to help put together a law. That way you ensure that the people making that specific law understand the information and the topic well, and they have no game to play. They're not seeking power. They're doing a term of service and helping to make the world a better place. It's visible. It's short-lived. Maybe it is or isn't compensated. I don't know, but it should not be a status game. And it is.
I like that idea. I would augment it slightly, and I would say that we had to try to balance the experts who vehemently disagree with each other. The table stakes being deep domain knowledge, right? But you can have one expert who's going to go one way and another go the other way. If you put them in a room, right, and you tell them you got to come up with a law, you're going to probably get through conflict, you're probably going to get the best law. If each member of that jury system, right, can agree, okay, I'll sign off on that. If you can get everyone to sign off on it, it's probably going to be a pretty good law. And then I would add one footnote. I would have sunset provisions in every law.
God, yes. Yes. revisit this after 5 years, 2 years, whatever.
Yeah.
Yes.
This law has a lifespan of 5 years, of 10 years, and at which time it will be revisited with the new information. What did the law do what we hoped it would do, right? Or did it fuck things up, right?
Yes. I mean, this is the biggest problem with centralized government, is that the feedback loops, they're so awfully slow. And yeah, in that scenario, like by having a limit on the laws must be revisited after a certain period of time, maybe ideally by different people than those who set the law in place in the first place. That way you have a much shorter, tighter feedback loop. And so you can learn and apply learnings, as opposed to like, well, I'm not going to bring it up. I'm up for re-election next term. Or, well, I put it in place back then. I can't admit I was wrong, so I'm not going to talk about it.
Exactly. And, say what you will, it is incenting all the wrong kinds of behaviors. And it's a power game. It's a status game. And it's also a congruity game. Even if you're a psychopath, you want to appear at least congruent in what you're advocating. But that goes back too, right? So if you advocated and won, like, there should be prohibition, it's going to be hard to change that person's mind to get them to pass the Volstead Act, right? So I like your idea about different people. I also love the idea that government rules as a service, right? That would make the feedback loops much tighter, much more information laden, because like we have laws on the books now, and you see these pop up from, they're always fun to look at, right? But like in Kentucky, it's illegal to have sex with a horse or whatever. That's probably a good law. But you know my point. Like, we have laws on the books that are still technically laws, right?
Yes.
That were written in 1828, which is absurd.
All right. So this is one of the things that I would love to turn an AI loose on. I would love to train an AI on every codified law in existence. I would love to give it the task, find me every single law that contradicts, find me every instance of case law with conflicting results, find me every instance of a law that's no longer relevant. Like, let's clean this up, because a lot of this just built up as cruft over time. Nobody has the bandwidth to go back and look at it again. But a lot of it, I think, was actually planned obsolescence is the wrong word, but planned complexity, because it keeps lawyers in business. The more complex the law is, the more they get to bill. The more hours they have to bill, and it's awful. And so we need to break down that incentive stack. And I think AI would be amazing to help clean up and recodify that into a smaller set of nice, clean laws.
You are clearly reading my mind, because one of the things that excites me most about AI is going to be the thing that is hardest to get done. And that is, it is going to attack a lot of deeply entrenched interests. And it's not going to be just laws, man. It's going to be medical research. Everything. It's going to be published peer-reviewed papers. Like, I want to set AI loose on everything and have it like come back and say, Jim, this is conflicting deeply here. And the outcome of, and it's the thing that's cool about this is not sci-fi. We will have the capability with foundational models, right, that are trained on massive data sets. And the other thing that they can do that we humans simply can't do, an array of 100 million different data points on a matrix, easy peasy, not a problem.
Yes.
The ability to look into liminal spaces, easy peasy. But like, we start, and so my idea is, let's start slow, right? So let's start with stories. Let's unleash AI on every story that we can get in digital format, right? And let's see what it finds there. Then let's set it loose on old research, right? Like, antiquated, the people are dead, right? The people who published those papers are dead. They're gone. And therefore, we can interrogate the veracity of their published conclusions. And then slowly, right? If we get the kinds of wins there that I think we will get, right? Then that is another way to build a mimetic contagion, so to speak, right? Like people will be like, well, wait a minute. What about all these laws? Right. And so I haven't landed on a way, and it would be great if you had a way to be able to do this without it almost certainly getting to like physical conflict.
Yeah. So, I mean, a few things. One, I agree with trying to drip out some of this slowly. I would probably run it in parallel tracks, though. I'd have my public track and my private track, because I think there's a lot of things that we need to go faster on, even if we're not making people clearly aware of it. The upsides are so enormous that delays, I mean, are going to cost lives effectively. Any delay in a lot of these things is going to be detrimental to human well-being. How to avoid the conflict is going to be very hard because it's impossible to please everybody, and we're still fear-based. But I think the best way, and you're right about starting with stories, I think that is probably the best place to start, because people love media. And if you give them more awesome media, they're going to start enjoying it. It's almost like a reverse frog in a pot. Like instead of turning up the heat, you're turning up the awesome. And so just over time, you don't really realize how much things are shifting. It's just enjoyable the whole time. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's just such a complex balance. I'll think about it though.
Do, because I'm fascinated by it, and I certainly want everybody's input, because like I'm not going to be able to think it up. But then as you were speaking, I'm also thinking, lives are a danger. Well, the problem there is that is also the basic argument of the precautionary principle, right? The precautionary principle, in my opinion, of course we have to take precautions. Of course. I mean, like one of the things that terrifies me about AI is we're going to have autonomous drones that are killing drones. And like the tech is trivially easy.
Yeah.
That it gives me a picture. I'll use myself. So here's Jim, facial recognition. It is programmed to only kill junk. And so no collateral damage, no missiles killing children. And like, that's really
bad and super easy and terrifying, because facial recognition is okay, but it's still really easy to fuck with.
Yeah.
So that's not ideal.
And so it's on the list of like, I am not a Panglossian optimist about anything, and certainly not about AI. Look, I am incredibly excited about the good side of what AI can do. I honestly believe that it is the tool that, used properly, we can use to literally upgrade society, right? And yet, of course, there are all of these bad things that we've got to figure out a solution to.
Every technology is a double-edged sword. The upside with AI is that you get to choose the system of rewards and weightings. Like you have control over what it is that is either pumping the brakes or the gas for this AI. We don't have that now with ourselves. Like our brain uses its emotional puppet strings with absolutely no real input from conscious us. Like that's just the way it rolls. But with AI, like we get to choose precisely what those puppet strings are and when and how they fire. Like that's amazing. So the idea that we're just going to suddenly accidentally create some super evil, destroy all humans, gray goo AI, I think is total bullshit. That's the dystopian sci-fi programming speaking. I think it's infinitesimal, but I think the upsides are enormous, and most of them are mundane. I mean, especially right now, like AI is really cool and we've made a lot of advances, but the mechanism by which we've made those advances is pretty mundane. So, and there's an enormous possibility space just with mundane AI that will be hugely transformational. Still a ways out from like the stuff that's going to be really mind-bending.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I think that I like your metaphor of the reverse frog, right? We can make experiences much more awesome and much less tedious or dull and boring. Like we're wired to like that, right? And so it's kind of like, I always say I look for things to root for as opposed to against, because like it's easy to root against almost anything, right? And yeah, but have you thought about, and like I've dealt with pessimists in the past who are really smart people, by the way. They're not dumb. And like they just get caught in this infinite loop of fear that, Alan Watts had a great line, which is worry is an endlessly peeled onion, right? And that's right. If literally you program your prover, so to speak, to find problems, guess what? Your life is going to be nothing but problems because it does its job very well. But I like the extension to the idea that doesn't have to be built into AI, right? The tech nerds call it maximizing the objective function. And what the Facebooks of the world maximize the objective function for was revenue for Facebook, right?
Yeah.
And like, I understand that they wanted to have a successful company, but we can maximize for creativity. We can maximize for human happiness. We can maximize for all these things. And, it starts also with like what's happening in education, right? That's another one of my things, right? I don't know if people my age are salvageable, right? Some are, but like I'm 62. I think I'm relatively tuned in to what's going on, but I'm probably wrong about a lot of stuff. And I don't know how, like what my subconscious is telling me, oh, Jim, no, don't do that. But if we go down and just the experience that we've had at Stability AI, we got the remit to educate a third of the African nation Malawi's children. And the early results, man, are like mind-blowing. They're mind-blowing. And I was meeting with one of the ambassadors when I was in Florida last week for the synthesis school. And I didn't even know that they were experimenting with AI. And like their results are ridiculous or off the charts. The thing that I like about that, though, is the AI is going to learn you, the child, is the data source. And the AI is going to continually refine itself until it communicates with that child perfectly in that child's voice that it understands and unlocks. I'm not afraid of math. I thought I was, but the AI has given me the path that I can understand math. I can understand physics, etc.
Yeah.
So,
we've built like the current education system is a conveyor belt with no control over speed or number of items. And so you end up with like Lucy cramming chocolate into her mouth in every crevice and pocket she has available just to keep up with the pace. I don't know what percentage of kids are doing well at the standard pace, but I'd guess it's not a majority. And this is exactly what we need. We need the ability to teach at somebody's pace in their style, with the number of repetitions that they need, the frequency that they need, the connections that they need. It's going to be different for everybody. So this is, that'll be amazing. Like the embodied young ladies primer with AI, customized education for everybody on any topic that you're interested in. Like, hell yes, please take 2.
Yeah, exactly. I'll take 4. And the problem is, like, again, we are bumping up against a system that maybe when they started this system, it had some reasonable points to it, but it is so antiquated. And one of the unintended, I hope unintended, consequences of it is we are going to make you a productive, i.e., producing member of society. And one of the unintended consequences of that is it crushes creativity. It crushes open-mindedness. If you look at the animal world, how do animals learn things? Playing, right?
Our system is optimized for growing GDP, not for human flourishing.
Exactly.
And we need to switch that. Like we need to get off of the one and start playing the other.
Exactly. And so, I could see somebody editing this and making me or you sound like firebrand communists, man. Like, we've got to stop optimizing for free markets, and we've got to begin optimizing for this. That is not the point here. The point here is that free markets deliver. They have a lot of problems.
Yes.
But they do deliver.
They work primarily because they're open, largely transparent, and have fast feedback loops.
Exactly. Right. And because they don't, like, only the free market can produce a pet rock, right? Like, it has no rational reason for existing, but the free market figured it out, and they figured, oh, and why don't we do Beanie Babies at the same time? Let's delight people, right? And we need to understand, I think, like, my degree is in economics, worthless, totally worthless, but like, it's because we thought that we could build this Rube Goldberg machine that would make like the most efficient delivery of goods. No, it's based on human desire, right? It's like, what is money but a technology that helps you get what you desire? And
people aren't rational. So if you try to engineer a rational system, it's not going to work.
Not going to work at all. And so that's why we had all of these blow-ups, of Keynesian econometric models. We've got it figured out. Well, we've got it, it's the great joke about economists. And the punchline is, assume we have a can opener. In other words, they have these cans they can't open. And the engineer is like, well, if we build this, I can open the can this way. And the scientist is, no, we can do it this way. And then the economist just goes, let's just assume we have a can opener. And so it's really interesting when you look and you take apart economic models about the planted axioms within them, right? Like, so the ones that dominated America, at least for, a good 50 years, the econometric models of the Keynesian variety, they literally assumed humans out of the equation. Basically, they're like, well, yeah, if you and I used to get in trouble, like in economics class, because like I would always have my hand up, and I would have these economists ever like actually gone to a marketplace and watched humans behave and how they pick things? And like, oh, that's irrelevant. That fucks with the model. Well, it's a bad model. And so one of the things that we're trying to do and make a tiny dent is like the whole fellowships thing. There is so much genius in this world. And now we can find it and we can fund it. And like, who knows what's going to happen? Like,
statistically, there are tens of millions of actual geniuses all over the world. And we're maybe aware of what, 0.1% of those, if that tiniest percentage.
That's
most of them are like tinkering away in their garages, completely oblivious, focused on their own passion, not trying to go out and monitor. Like, who knows? Or rural Africa, they never have access to the piece of information they're missing. You could have as many variants of that as you want. Yeah, amazing. Trying to hunt down those people and give them the leg up they need and the resources they need to express their genius is great. And I think that's actually the single biggest thing in favor of a post-scarcity economy, is that it puts everybody in a position to express whatever genius they have.
Yes. And the thing is, back to like, I'm a huge fan of history. I love Will and Ariel Durant. Lessons of History is a great book, I think. But by the same token, we are looking at, maybe n equals 1. And by that, I mean, we are looking at, or you make the point yourself, for all of human history, our condition has been one of scarcity. And therefore, that leads to a certain type of behavior. Most of it is not optimal in terms of that behavior. And so, like, included in that, right, is, I think that genius probably is, if not normally distributed in a fashion where you can find it in the tails or whatever. But my point is, for all of human history, probably like for every Da Vinci that we know about, right, there's a million others that we don't know about. that they didn't know they were geniuses because they were a French peasant and they never left the village, right?
I mean, they think that something around 110 billion humans have lived, most of those now dead. And out of all of those, the number that have visibly moved history is maybe 10,000.
So let's get to some of your suggested solutions. I think a lot of them are great, and let's share them with our listeners and viewers.
Yep. So I talked about a couple of them a little bit earlier, but I'll run through them in order. So the first is to reduce the flow of negative information into your mind. Like every single source of negative information feeding into your mind is literally poisoning your psyche, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. So you need to find and excise all of those as much as possible. I mean, if it were up to me, I would start putting laws in place to restrict misincentivized information sources. Like you can't frame things this way in order to make money. That's not okay. You need to be unbiased, partisan in how you present your information. That would be ideal. The second is to increase the volume of positive information. Look for good stories. Go out and find people like Hans Rosling, who's covered all of the amazing advances and the benefits to society that we've experienced. So you can reframe your perspective. Like the media makes everything look like it's on fire and we're all dying and going to hell tomorrow. And the reality is things are better than they've ever been across almost every possible metric all over the world. So you need to shift that frame by changing your information diet on both points. The next is ideally to create an incentivized system that gets people to stop seeing everybody around them as others. Like we're not American or French or Chinese or Russian. We're not black or white or brown. We're humans of Earth. We're all stuck on this tiny little dot floating through space with an infinite number of things that could wipe us out at any moment. And we're one tribe, and we need to think of ourselves as one tribe and drop all of this micro-tribal bullshit that's separating everybody. And the easiest way to do that is to start seeing everybody around you as an opportunity to be kind. Everybody. If you're looking for those chances to be kind to a stranger, now everybody is not an other. They are a friend, a part of the in-group, because you're not kind to people who aren't part of your in-group. You have to see them as part of that group in order to put effort into doing things for them. So that I think would cause a pretty radical shift to be adopted. But the last is like, we cannot yet get rid of our us versus them wiring entirely. We may be able to see ourselves as humans of Earth, but we're going to need to shift that tribalism another level out. And I personally think that the best target for that at the moment is death, because all of the scientific research I'm seeing seems to indicate that biological immortality, at least, is not only possible, but probable with the advances that we're working on making. There are already at least half a dozen, maybe a dozen different biologically immortal species on our own planet that we have found and studied and looked into. Like this isn't pie in the sky or preposterous. It's just an information problem, and we're well underway solving it. So I think by shifting that, by changing, because so much of our fear is rooted in our finiteness. Our lives are short. We're all going to die. And so everything is a potential death sentence in some way, shape, or form. If we can eliminate the death sentence, if now our time horizon isn't 60 or 70 or 80 years, but 60 or 70 or 80,000 or million, like if we can actually make ourselves biologically immortal and our time horizon shifts, it unlocks an entire new cognitive space and infinite opportunities. But I think that both terrifies and excites a lot of people. There's so much baggage, psychological and biological, associated with death. I think that may be the single hardest piece to get people's minds wrapped around. And it would be maybe a terrible thing if we accomplished that before we fixed some of these other pieces. I mean, the last thing we need is a Putin or a Mao in charge for millennia, right? But I do think that it is a place we should be aiming. It is the other we should be focused against. And until then, we really should be seeing ourselves as humans of Earth and try to be optimistic.
Yeah, I love the humans of Earth. I'm also fascinated by the biological strides being made to at least, if not make humans immortal, extend their lifespans to an extent that would unlock that change of thought. Yeah, right.
Yes. It'll be health span first, lifespan second.
Yeah.
But I mean, once you reach that tipping point where your advances in health span and lifespan start outpacing aging, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, technology is good enough that for every year we live, we add 2. At that point, it's effectively infinite.
Yeah, which is cool. But I immediately flash on a series that it was a guilty pleasure of mine called Altered Carbons. And it envisioned such a thing. It envisioned that our single body didn't live forever, but they figured out a way to take our consciousness, which of course is a conceit, because if it's outside of us, it's not going to help having a stack built into but let's assume that it is internal and you have the stack in the back that holds you, right? And then you just change it in different bodies, clones, whatever. And of course, it's a dystopia because the Meths, the Methuselahs, right, who achieved it first, they have all the money, they have all of the power, they live in the clouds, right? And so, even something as kind of cool as the idea of expanding health span and lifespan, automatically the story gets told of a conflict with, and it's crazy, right?
It's the same zero-sum bullshit. Because if you think about it, there's not really, if you're at a point technologically where you could extend your lifespan effectively indefinitely, you have all of this time to do things, learn things, see things, consume things. You're going to need a lot of people to do those. And people are going to be able to do those things better and better the longer they're around. I can't think of any realistic incentive not to make that available to everybody, because that technological path is running in parallel and in places overlapping with energy abundance, as well as, atomic and subatomic manufacturing. Like, it's going to be, if you have limitless energy, the ability to build anything you want at the atomic or subatomic scale and longevity, there is no incentive stack to be zero sum in any fashion. As many people as you want, all over the world, all over the universe. It doesn't make a difference.
Exactly. And it reminds me of the thought experiment that I read about in Darren Brown's book, Happy, more or less, I think is the title. Happiness is the subject. And he refers to a thought experiment this guy came up with, which is, so you wake up, you're the only living human on the planet, right? And what are you going to do? And what I love about it is it speaks to what you just said. If you wake up and your zero-sum thinking is still there, what are you going to do? Okay, I'm going to go get the fanciest clothes, and I'm going to drive Lambos everywhere, and I'm going to live in a palace. But you know what? After you do that, you're going to realize, well, shit, that's really inconvenient. Those Lambos are really temperamental. I want a conveyance that is reliable. And I don't give a shit what it looks like because I'm not trying to impress anybody. And am I going to wear like really fancy clothes? No, I'm going to wear comfortable clothes that are durable. Same with food. Am I going to try to come up with the craziest inventions? Maybe that would be something I might experiment with, but probably not. I'm probably going to want to find a nutrition source that is endless, right? And you become happy.
Yeah. So many of the targets people are aiming for are status-based or mimetic-based. They haven't really thought it through. Want it because somebody else has it or because they think it'll elevate their status. I mean, Lamborghinis are fun to drive, but as a daily driver forever? No.
Same wavelength. And what I love about it, though, is it fits very nicely in with your idea that when we do make these breakthroughs, and what I started our conversation with, the implications of digital replication are profound, and they affect everything, right? And so, I'm going to do a book, right? And I have a guy who's going to be my editor. He's already on the team. You know him, Batzel. And we're going to do a physical book just for fun, but the electronic book is endless. You want 1 million? Sure. Here's 1 million. You want 10 million? Okay. No problem. We can do 10 million. What's the extra cost? Zero. Zero is extra cost.
Exactly.
And so that type of world is really hard to grok because when you start thinking about it, like Kevin Kelly, the guy who founded Wired, has a good book about this. And he's like, well, what can't be created with zero additional cost? Well, things like trust, things like good taste, the whole idea of curating something that helps people like read really cool stuff. And he's got a great list, but I love the way that it ties in with this notion of happiness. How is it that amid, as you point out, amid possibly the greatest amount of plenty that humans as a species have ever had, right? And by the way, I am not ignoring the slums of Nigeria or Mumbai. We got a bunch of shit to fix. Absolutely. And let's get to work fixing it, right? Let's use tech to figure out a way to inoculate against malaria. These are all obtainable things now, right now.
Super.
And
we already produced more than enough food to feed everybody, more than enough energy to power everybody if we could just get it where it needed to be.
Exactly. Well, man, I could talk to you about this endlessly. I'm now nearing my end. My nanny she's going to ultimately put a shock system in my chair where she can remotely shock me to stop me. But I could talk about this with you forever. What are the hopes for the book? I love it. I'll recommend it. We'll give copies of it away.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that it's digitally free. I mean,
which I love,
perfectly in line with the concept. Like, this should be available to anyone everywhere. It needs to be available in that fashion. If you want a print book, you can pay for it if that's your jam, but digital is going to be free forever. My hopes are just that the right people will find it and read it and embody it and start accelerating that change. I mean, the higher profile they are, the better, so that they can pull other people along with them. But that's it. I mean, I'm a marketer by trade, but I don't really love marketing books. It's a weird dichotomy with me. But when I put something out there, I try and put it in front of people when it's relevant, but I can't shove it down everybody's throat because I feel it takes away I'm blanking on the word, but the serendipity.
Yeah.
If you try and push it out to everybody, yes, like more people will read it, but they may not get it at the right time. Exactly. But if you just put it out there and let it kind of flow naturally, it will get to the right people at the right time. So something about that feels better to me.
Me too. I love it. So I, for one, have read and loved the book. I recommend everyone listening. It's free. You have no excuse. You can download it and read it and think about it and just start thinking about, like, what if we did this? You know, I'm sure that there are problems, right, that we haven't uncovered. That's why I'm such a believer in open source. It's cognitive diversity, right? Like, you can't ask somebody to conceive of something they can't conceive of.
There are still plenty of dragons.
Exactly. Well, this has been a blast as usual. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you the last time I had you on, which is, okay, I am making you the emperor of the world. You can't kill anybody. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp, but you can incept them with the magic mic. You're going to speak into it. Two things. It's going to incept the entire population of the world. And everyone is going to wake up the next day and think it was their idea, and they're going to start doing it. What two things are you incepting?
I would say optimism and excitement for the future would be the first and probably most important, just to reframe that. And then the second would be to start seeing yourself as a human of Earth and to drop all of the other tribes.
Oh, I love them. Those are great. How can we find you?
On Twitter, Sams_antics, and the book is just at thegrandredesign.com.
Perfect. Sam, as always, love talking to you. Your ideas are infectious, and let's hope we can make it hundreds of us, not dozens of us.
Yes, please.
I have great hopes that we will. So thanks a lot, man.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.